Good evening, the hour of 6:30 p.m. Having arrived, I will call to order this regular meeting of the Joint Planning Board and the Planning Licenses and Development Committee. This meeting is being broadcast live on the City of Keene YouTube channel. The video is also streamed on the city's website and is posted online by the end of the next business day, barring any technical difficulties. Anyone wishing to view a copy of the agenda and supporting materials will find it on the city website. To receive electronic copies of future agenda packets, please go to the home page at keenenh.gov and subscribe to the city meetings email list. The public and other board members will be recognized to ask questions and make comments on the agenda item under discussion. After being recognized, all remarks are to be made through the chair. Anyone who wishes to address the committee is asked to go to one of the microphones in the room and identify themselves by name and address prior to speaking. I just wanted to add one thing tonight because sometimes I look out into the audience and there are a few people here that I want to tell you the difference between the two committees. The one on the left are appointed by the mayor. We are the planning board, and I am the chair of the planning board. And on my right is the PLD committee, Planning, Licenses, and Development. These are your elected officials, and the chair for that particular committee is Councilor Bosley.
I answered anything.
Okay. So, and Councilor Bosley, and I chair the meetings on opposite months, just so you get a clear understanding. So those are my comments for tonight. So will staff please take the roll? Roll call.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the Planning Board, Pamela Russell-Slack,
Present.
David Orgaz,
Present.
Mayor George Hansel,
Here.
Councilor Mike Remy, Emily Levine Bernier,
Here.
Harold Farrington,
Here.
Roberta Mastrogiovanni, Armando Rangel,
Here.
Gail Summers, Randon Markelin,
Here.
Tammy Adams, and Kenneth Cost. And Madam Chair, we did hear from both Ken and Councilor Remy that they would not be able to make it tonight.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then for the PLD committee, Kate Bosley,
Present.
Mike Giacomo,
Here.
Phil Jones, Gladys Johnson,
Here.
Raleigh Omerad.
Here.
Thank you. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from the October 17th, 2022 minutes?
Move to approve the minutes of the previous meeting as presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Are there any questions, comments, changes? Seeing any, not seeing any. All in favor? Thank you. The first item on the agenda is a public workshop. Ordinance number 0-2022-19 relating to amendments to the City of Keene Land Development Code, zoning regulations and application procedures. The petitioner, the City of Keene Community Development Department, proposes to amend sections of Chapter 100 Land Development Code of the City Code of Ordinances to clarify language with the zoning regulations in Articles 9, 11, and 13 of the LDC, amend Article 15, Congregate Living and Social Service Conditional Use Permit, to add a new section called Conditional Use Permit Waiver, and amend Section 25.4.3 of Article 25, Application Procedures, to modify the process for amending the sections of the LDC that are outside the zoning regulations. And Mary, I believe you're going to do the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mary Brenner, Senior Planner. I do have a presentation to just walk through the proposed changes tonight. This ordinance is sort of a housekeeping ordinance. It's a collection of items that staff have just noticed over the past 6 months or so, where we thought some clarification could be needed, and a couple of other more substantive changes that I'll go into in just a moment. So with no further ado, oh, and another quick reminder, so this is the public workshop phase of the ordinance. So tonight, you can make changes to the ordinance and still move it forward. So, and actually, staff does have a proposed addition to the ordinance if the committee is willing to do that. All right, so the first proposed amendment is for section 9.3.2.2. This section of the Land Development Code specifies that there's a 3-foot setback for driveways from the side property line. The proposed amendment would clarify that that doesn't have to apply to common driveways that serve more than one lot. I put up an image just to kind of illustrate a typical common driveway. This is pretty common where it would actually kind of straddle the property line. Up until this point, staff has been interpreting, that a common driveway doesn't need to comply with the side property line, and this would just clarify that. Are there any questions about this proposed change? Okay. The next proposed amendment is to clarify a section within Article 11, which is the Surface Water Protection Conditional Use Permit section of the zoning regulations. There's a section of this article that says what activities are permitted without a CUP. And then there's a section of this ordinance that talks about which activities are permitted with a CUP being a conditional use permit. So within the section that talks about what's allowed without a CUP, it says that new driveways for single and two-family homes, provided that the driveway serves to access uplands on a lot or lots of record that existed at the time this overlay district was first adopted. So basically what this means is if you have a parcel of land that was in existence before the Surface Water Protection Ordinance went into effect, and you would have to cross wetlands or cross a wetland buffer in order to build a driveway, you can. Then on the, this would be the right side of the table, this is activities that are permitted with a CUP. It says that the construction of new roads, driveways, in parentheses, excluding single and two-family driveways and parking lots. So we're proposing to delete the stricken text as follows. So we would be basically deleting the text that's in the parentheses. And the reason for that is that not all single and two-family driveways are exempt. It's only single and two-family driveways for lots of record that existed at the time the ordinance was adopted. And so we thought it was a little bit confusing to have that section kind of implying that all single and two-family driveways would be exempt, whereas the other section that I referenced earlier specifically says it's only for lots of record that existed when the ordinance was adopted. So again, that's just to clarify what the intent was there. Are there any questions on this one?
I think we're all set. I don't see anyone with their hand.
Not so much a question, but
Okay, go ahead.
thank you, Madam Chair. I
You're
mean,
welcome.
I don't like the idea of just having an arbitrary, more or less, date and then treating two different landowners differently. Just because the city passed an ordinance on X date, we're regulating those parcels of land in a different way. Like, that just doesn't sit well with me. I'm fine with it for now, but what I'd really like to see is we have our local setbacks for wetlands and all that stuff. The state has their setbacks and everything for wetlands. I want to know how the Surface Water Protection Ordinance has really played out in for residential properties. I know that there have been some for commercial, and it has definitely affected things and probably protected some vernal pools and stuff, but maybe we haven't had enough residential development to know, but I would be curious just to know if this is effective. But that's probably for a different day.
All right, any other comments on this piece? Okay. So the next sort of I'll call it a clarification amendment, is in Article 13, which is the telecommunications ordinance. So Section 13.1.3.c, we would like to clarify, and this is under, again, exemptions, that co-location and modification applications as defined in New Hampshire RSA 12K are exempt from conditional use permit and major site plan review. This is something that's set at the state level. The state RSA already says that they are exempt from any local land use permitting and zoning. So this is just to be consistent with what the state RSA says. I did include the definitions in the table at the bottom. They're a little bit long, so I'm not going to necessarily read them out loud unless folks are really interested in digging into that. But basically what this means is if you have an existing telecommunications array and you want to add to it, and you don't meet the threshold for a substantial modification, which there's a specific definition for that, then you're exempt from local land use and zoning. And the way that we had it worded today is a little bit confusing, and it inadvertently kind of created a loophole that's been taken advantage of, because the way that we worded it was telecommunications facilities placed on existing mounts, building, or structures, or modifications to existing telecommunications facilities would be exempt. The way that's written, you could read it as a brand new facility being placed on a building where there are no existing telecommunications antenna would be exempt, and that was not the intent. So we just want to clarify that it's specifically co-location, so you're adding to an existing array, or a modification to an existing facility would be exempt.
Councilor Bog.
So I just want to clarify for my own understanding that we have written some ordinances in regards to small wireless facilities in the public rights-of-way, and we do have criteria for like the visual aesthetic and some other, would they still be required to meet those criteria, or could they take a pole that's been designed a certain way and then like stick something on it that doesn't really fit in with the intent?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a great question. So this is specific to installations on private property. So the small wireless facilities is for, that's like a completely separate licensing process that's in city code outside of the land development code, and that process is through Public Works. This is specific to installations on private property. So, for example, if someone came in today and wanted to install a brand new system on let's say the side of a building where there is no array, they could make the argument that it's exempt under under the language that we currently have in our ordinance, and so we want to close up that loophole. So this is the first part of that. So basically, instead of trying to rephrase these really long and complicated definitions from RSA 12K, we're just going to directly reference it. And then the second proposal is to clarify that the installation of a brand new telecommunications facility on a building or structure would require the conditional use permit and potentially site plan review if it met the threshold. So the proposed language is in bold and underlined. So it would read, the installation of new ground-mounted or structure-mounted towers and antennas, if camouflaged, or a substantial modification to an existing tower or mount that would maintain its camouflage may occur within Zone 2 or Zone 3 of the View Preservation Overlay Map, et cetera, et cetera. So are there any questions about those two changes? They kind of go together, so.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, thank you.
And this slide just shows it's the table 13-1, which we're proposing to add a row, again, to clarify that camouflaged or non-camouflaged new under structure mounted would require the CUP and site plan review, which is what SPR stands for in that table. Okay. All right, so that kind of ends the clarifications section of this ordinance. The next two are a little bit more substantive and kind of grew out of a couple different issues that we've been noticing over the last few months. So the first proposed amendment is to amend Article 15. That's the article within the zoning regulations that deals with the congregate living and social service conditional use permit. And the proposal is to add a section that would allow the planning board to grant a waiver on a case-by-case basis from the review criteria in section 15.2 of Article 15. But in order to do so, the planning board would have to find that all three of the proposed waiver criteria are met. I include, that language is in your packet, and I can read through it if you would like. But part of the reason for why we're bringing this proposal to you tonight is because we've had a couple of applications go through this process now. And I think in at least a couple of the cases, there's been some concern over the fact that if an applicant wants to seek relief from one of those review criteria, they would have to go to the Zoning Board of Adjustment to get a variance, which is a bit of a process to go through. We have our zoning administrator here tonight who could answer questions about how it works, but basically you have to go to a separate board, you have to meet the standard variance criteria. One of them is probably gonna, I think it's unnecessary hardship, is that right? That unnecessary hardship. And that's the criteria that's really difficult to meet. And so the idea behind this was to allow the same board that's reviewing the application to be able to grant relief from some of the criteria. I think, yep, I did put them up on this slide if you want to read through what's proposed. But the idea behind this is that it would be a little bit more strict than the planning board's typical waiver criteria that are in the site plan review standards or the subdivision.
Excuse me,
review
Mary,
standards.
I don't know if anybody has the agenda for tonight, but it's actually on page 25, if you don't want to look at the TV.
Great, thank you. Yes, it is on page 25 of your packet.
Can I ask one quick question?
Council Moser.
Can, before we get too deep into this, can you cover what the CUP criteria that you're talking about the waivers would apply to?
Yeah, if you'd like, I can pull up, I don't think we have a copy of the LDC down here, but I could pull up the review criteria if that would be helpful to show what they are. Okay, I'm just going to pull them up on my screen really quick. If you bear with me for just a moment. All right, is that okay? Could people see the screen? So,
Mary, are you comfortable giving us just a quick headline of what they are?
sure, yep. So the review criteria are in section 15.2 of the Land Development Code. And these are the review criteria that the planning board has to consider when deciding whether or not to grant a CUP. In addition to these criteria, oftentimes they'll also be applying their site plan development standards as well. So there's those 13 standards on top of these. But the first one, A, states that the nature of the proposed application is consistent with the spirit and intent of the zoning regulations, this LDC, and the city's comprehensive master plan, and complies with all the applicable standards in this LDC for the particular use in section 8.3.4. Standard B says the proposed use will be established, maintained, and operated so as to not endanger the public health, safety, or welfare. C says the proposed use will be established, maintained, and operated so as to be harmonious with the surrounding area and will not impede the development, use, and enjoyment of adjacent property. In addition, any parking lots, outdoor activity area, or waiting areas associated with the use shall be adequately screened from adjacent properties and from public rights-of-way. D, the proposed use will be of a character that does not produce noise, odors, glare, and/or vibration that adversely affects the surrounding area. E, the proposed use will not place an excessive burden on public infrastructure, facilities, services, or utilities. F, the proposed use will not result in the destruction, loss, or damage of any feature determined to be of significant natural, scenic, or historic importance. G, the proposed use will not create a traffic safety hazard or a substantial increase in the level of traffic congestion in the vicinity of the use. And the last one is H, the proposed use will be located in proximity to pedestrian facilities, for example, multi-use trails and sidewalks, public transportation, or offer transportation options to its client population. Did you?
I think that's great. I just would like to know what we're talking about giving authority to waive before we continue the discussion.
Okay. All right, so.
I'm sorry, Mary. Mayor Hansel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, I mean, may need to do some training with the planning board as this goes through, because I don't think that they're used to evaluating things like this. Zoning board has, but you may have to, I assume you've contemplated that.
Yeah, so for this, the wording in this says that the planning board shall find, and that's not something that the planning board generally does. So I think what the zoning board does, which I think is a really good practice, is for each specific criteria, they actually do a separate vote on each criteria. And I think that in any case where a board is making a finding, that's probably what should be done. So that's something that the planning board would need to sort of shift and get trained on doing. And that way, because the way that this is written, all three criteria must be met. So a majority of the members voting and present have to find that each of the three criteria are met. So that would be a vote for each of the criteria.
Any other questions? Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay.
Okay. And then this last one is actually something that the city attorney is strongly recommending. But we as staff also agree in the community development department. This is just modifying the procedure to modify the land development code. So right now, the land development code put a bunch of different regulations from different sections of city code and put them all into one physical document. However, the different sections within the land development code used to have different processes for how they were amended, and now they're all the same general process. And the city attorney and us as well are recommending that we separate them back out into their own processes. So sections 1 through 18 of the land development code are the zoning regulations, and those would continue to follow the zoning amendment process as proposed. I've kind of outlined it on the slide, but basically there's a first reading of an ordinance at city council. That ordinance gets referred to the public workshop, which is where we are tonight, of the joint committee of the planning board and the PLD committee. It's in the workshop phase until it's in a form that everyone's comfortable with and gets sent back to city council. At the next city council meeting, the mayor sets a public hearing date. There's a public hearing where the public can comment on the ordinance. Then it goes to the Planning, Licenses, and Development Committee for review and recommendation. And then with whatever recommendation comes out of PLD, it goes back to city council. And then at that point, If the PLD committee recommends further changes, it goes back and restarts the process. And that is intentionally meant to make sure that the process is slow enough that members of the public can follow along and take part at multiple points in the process, because changing the zoning ordinance is a pretty big deal. However, everything outside of the zoning regulations, so Articles 19 through 28, currently, as written, have to go through that same process in addition to, in some cases, additional public hearings. So, for example, the planning board regulations currently have to go through a public hearing with the planning board and then go through that whole process that I just outlined. Same thing with the historic district regulations. So what we're proposing is that the planning board regulations would go through a public hearing with the planning board and then just go through the normal ordinance process with city council. So it cuts out the public workshop piece. And the public hearing. So it would go to planning board for a public hearing, then it, assuming the planning board votes to approve it, it would go to city council, then it would get referred to PLD, and then PLD would make a recommendation, it would go back to city council. And that would be the end of the process. Same thing with Historic District Commission, except it would start out with a public hearing with Historic District Commission. And then everything else, which is Articles 23 through 28, would just be the normal city ordinance process. So that's what we're proposing. We think it would really make it a lot simpler and easier to make changes outside of the zoning ordinance, because we've also identified a lot of sort of housekeeping items outside of the zoning regulations, but right now they have to go through the full zoning amendment process.
Any questions? Okay, thank you.
All right, so that's everything that was in the ordinance. We did have one other item that we left off the ordinance accidentally. We had identified a while back and just, it fell off our list for some reason. But, so we are asking you to consider amending the ordinance or voting on an amended version tonight, which would create a version A. And this is another clarification. So currently in Article 9, there, Section 9.2.7, subsection C, subsection 2 of the Land Development Code, there's a provision for the ZBA to grant a major parking reduction of up to 50% using a special exception process. And subsection 2 states, in determining whether to grant a special exception, the Zoning Board of Adjustment shall make the following findings in addition to those required for a special exception. And then A, the specific use or site has such characteristics that the number of required parking spaces is too restrictive. And B, the requested reduction will not cause long-term parking problems for adjacent properties or anticipated future uses. The zoning administrator is here tonight, and he can talk about why this change is being proposed. But basically what we're proposing is to remove that text that was in bold and just have those first two criteria that are on the screen be the criteria that the ZBA considers. And I'll let John Rogers.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. So when the LDC was done, prior to the LDC, if you have to meet your on-site parking requirements, and those are all laid out in the zoning code. When we did the LDC, we actually expanded upon from three ways to meet your requirement to 5 ways. And one of these was this major reduction, and at the time we felt we would apply the special exception as well as the 2 additional criteria that you see on the board in front of you. We then did have application come before us for this reduced parking, and the zoning board had a really difficult time applying the special exception criteria that sits in the zoning code, because those are really, there's 7 of them, and they're really dealing with allowing a use to occur on a site only with a special exception. And this is with parking's certainly an accessory use on almost every piece of property. So most of the criteria the the board had a difficult time going through and during their deliberations and actually really trying to find findings of fact to meet this. Upon review and review of the minutes, and the board really felt that these two criteria were the one that spoke to parking itself. And again, this is really meant for the accessory parking that's needed on site. This would not be applied to, obviously, for a primary parking use or anything such as that. So that's again, after listening to the ZBA after that application, we took a look at it and felt this was an appropriate amendment to the LDC, and it would still meet the intent of allowing that reduction if this criteria can be met. I'd also point out that part of this, for this reduction, there's another parking study that has to be applied for, which isn't done with any of the other reductions. So it's a pretty big lift for the applicant to hire and pay for a consultant to come in and do a parking study to apply for this reduction. So just wanted to put that out there, that there is still some additional information that gets in front of the board because of that parking study, which with the previous application, the board actually found very helpful to have that as a point of discussion. And I can certainly answer any questions that the committee might have.
No one has any questions? Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you.
So that's all I had tonight for the presentation. Happy to answer any questions on the overall ordinance.
Are there any board members that have any questions for Mary or John? Okay, thank you, Mary. I see that there are no questions. While this is not a formal public hearing, if there's anyone here in the public that wanted to offer any comments or questions on the proposed ordinance, is there anyone here? Okay, thank you. So at this time, I'm going to close the public workshop for deliberation. And are there any questions?
Yes, thank you. So obviously, there were a lot of items that we looked at tonight up on the screen. I'm really comfortable with all of them except for one. I think that granting the authority for the planning board to waive the CUP criteria is a little bit of a stretch for me as a counselor who sat through about 2.5 years of land development code input from the community. And I can say that that whole process of developing the social services ordinance was, it was started with the intention that it would be completed before the land development code even came before the joint committee or the council. And it was such a controversial piece of work that we did that it ran into the land development code and eventually was folded in. And that whole process meant that we sort of threaded this really fine needle of listening to the public's concerns and understanding our community's need for social services and finding a way that they could cohabitate together. And I didn't hear a single CUP criteria that I'm comfortable that isn't appropriate to be in that ordinance or that we shouldn't be asking people to meet. I think that all of those items in there really, really have a place in creating a harmonious community on both sides. So ultimately, I would ask that we take that out. If it's something that the staff thinks that they would like to have it considered, I would like to see it considered separately from the main meat of this ordinance.
Do any other board members have any questions? Counselor Amarad. Amaro.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was listening very carefully, and I heard what Mary said about Article 15, that there's some value, perhaps some value in having the same board that decides upon them at the first come back and be able to review how they're interpreted and if they're really necessary. When I thought about that, I'm not sure I quite agree, because you have a legislative process, and then you have a judicial review process. And right now, they're two separate processes. And I think that's the way we want to keep it. I don't think we want to get rid of that judicial process or have that with the same board. So I like everything else that was done, but that's my concern with Article 15. I am not in favor of the changes that are being proposed.
Any other comments? Mayor Hansel.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I mean, I'll take the opposite side of the argument. I think it makes good sense to only have these organizations come before the board. I don't think we're removing the public's, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think we're removing the public's opportunity to come and testify on these various issues. One advantage to this change that I see is it'll help take some of the politics out of these really difficult decisions, and it will put a quasi-judicial board in charge of potentially granting those conditional use permits. That just makes sense to me. I think I've been through enough of these to understand that they become very political very quickly, and sometimes these discussions and these decisions can get away from the meat of the decision-making, which is to evaluate any applicant's adherence to the criteria. I mean, that's ultimately what the city is trying to do as a regulator, and I think this change would allow us to do that better. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Well, I'm going to agree with Council Hansel. We had something come to the planning board. I was just talking to you. No, just kidding. I'm going to agree with Mayor Hansel. We had something come to the planning board from an agency, and I think it was very difficult at the time that night to come up with an answer for them, but we did, and we did not go to the zoning board. So I agree with this. It's 15.5 conditional use permit waiver. Does anyone else have any other comments? Okay, with that said, I'm not sure how people want to move forward, but is there a motion to amend the draft ordinance?
I would make the motion to amend the draft ordinance in a way that is consistent with the staff recommended change. Is that enough of a motion for you to go on?
Could be Alicia.
Yes, I think that that's sufficient as long as you specify in the motion that you are moving to recommend the motion with the proposed language from staff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Oh, thank you. So, with that, then I will,
Sorry,
off.
Madam
I'm
Chair,
sorry,
to
Mary.
interject. So I think right now, we're looking for two separate motions, one from the planning board and one from the planning licenses
Okay.
and development committee. Yep.
So we're just approving the amendment.
Okay,
So the motion on the floor is to approve the amendment, the staff recommended amendment
okay,
currently.
thank you.
So,
you want to go first? Who goes first, me?
just raise.
Well, I think
Is it-
as a complete board, we're voting on the amendment to incorporate the staff's recommended changes into a B version.
Yep.
And then we can decide what to do from there as two separate groups.
Okay.
Mayor Hensel, just a point of clarification there. That would be an A version.
A version.
Yeah, sorry.
So
What did you say?
it would be an A version.
Okay.
Accepting those amendments.
Okay. And is that the motion that's in then?
Yes.
Okay. And we don't need a roll call vote, just all in favor? Or we do?
Show of hands.
Show of hands. All in favor? Okay, thank you.
So before we go any further, I would further move to recommend striking the language regarding the waiver for the planning board. And I would like to caution the planning board, which I know that that you see the value in this change. And I'm just want to explain the process a little bit about what's going to happen. So if we leave this language for this waiver inside this packaged ordinance with all of these other changes, and it goes to council, and council does not agree that this is an appropriate course of action, the whole thing will fail and start back here, and all of the other housekeeping amendments will not make it. So my advice is that we amend this ordinance to remove this language and allow staff to bring a separate ordinance, and we can see how that will stand on its own merits in order to not lose all of these housekeeping items tonight, because my concern is that it's not going to make it through council.
Mayor Hansel.
I didn't
can't-
raise my hand, huh?
Well, you're doing this, so I really wasn't sure what that meant.
No, I see that as a strategy for the planning board members to consider. I don't know. I don't think I'll be voting in favor of the proposed amendment because I just don't feel that way.
Okay.
I don't actually agree with it either. So,
That's fair.
I mean, I know that they wanted some of these voted on tonight. However, if the council doesn't vote on it, then it will come back.
Yes, and it will come back in its entirety.
So we did have a second, I'm assuming.
No, there was not. There was no second.
Move to amend. Move to amend.
Move, there you go. So
Second.
Now there is. Oh. That's okay. All in favor
Of the amendment?
of the amendment? The amendment. All opposed?
So I'd just like to caution this board tonight that you might see a replica of that vote at council.
Then it'll be close. Thank you. So, the next item on the agenda is the housing needs
Yep.
analysis.
Madam Chair, sorry to interject again. So at this point, we do need the two separate votes. So one would be for the planning board to find the ordinance as amended. So you're including the CUP waiver recommendation as well as the recommendation from staff tonight. And that will go through as an A version to city council.
Okay,
So the planning board motion is to find it consistent with the master plan, and then PLD's motion would be to recommend that the mayor set a public hearing date.
okay,
So, Madam Chair, if I may,
yeah,
I'll move, as much as the master plan contemplates these very technical changes to the zoning code, I will move to find these amendments consistent with the comprehensive master plan.
is there a second?
I will second.
Thank you. All in favor? Thank you.
So for the PLD committee, will move to request that the mayor set a public hearing for the ordinance O-2022-19.
Second?
And I would just like to let the committee know that regardless of how we voted, that the mayor is required to set a public hearing, so. All in favor? Opposed? And that's unanimous. I don't think legally we can not.
I appreciate the encouragement.
Thank you very much. Okay. So the next item on the agenda is the Housing Needs Analysis Project. Mary, are you the one that's presenting for this too? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm actually going to share my screen again, just to have a few more slides to show you tonight. All right, so this should be a pretty brief presentation. Mostly what we wanted to do tonight was give this board an overview of the Housing Needs Analysis Project that's currently underway and answer any questions. We're mostly setting the stage for you because the next time we talk about this, we'll actually have our consultants. They'll be attending virtually, I believe, in the March meeting, and then attending in person in the April meeting at the joint committee meetings to present the draft and then the final report respectively. So you'll be hearing more about this. But just to start us off, what is a housing needs assessment and why are we doing one? I think many of you have heard about, the housing concerns from the community. So a housing needs assessment is a data-driven report that helps us answer the question, what housing is needed today and what housing will be needed in the future. It involves a lot of different data sets. So it involves compiling and evaluating demographic data, economic trends, looking at our current housing inventory and our current housing characteristics, housing market conditions. It involves getting stakeholder input, and just looking at a very wide range of data and then doing a detailed analysis of that data and breaking it down by different categories to really get at the question, where is our housing demand coming from today and where do we expect it to come from in the future, and what are some strategies that we could pursue to meet that demand now and in the future. So there's nothing that's going to be coming out of this report that would actually change anything. This is really an informational report that will then hopefully be used to support informed decision making in the future. This slide just shows a quick overview of the scope of work. I'm not going to go into detail. I will mention, however, that the consultant that was selected for this project is Camoin Associates, which is an economic development firm, and this project is being funded by the InvestNH Housing and Opportunity Planning and Zoning Grant through, I believe it's through the Business of Economic Affairs. So that's the InvestNH $100 million initiative coming out of the governor's office that is helping to fund this. I will note there is also a regional housing assessment that's going on right now. That started, I think, a little over a year ago, and it's still ongoing. I think it's expected to wrap up in March. And we are collaborating, and we've been meeting with Southwest Region Planning Commission to make sure that we're being consistent in our messaging and that we're complementing that ongoing effort. So we have met twice to coordinate with data sharing and messaging. We are using some of the data that was collected through that regional effort. For example, they did a region-wide survey on housing. 90 of those responses were from Keene, so the responses from Keene were shared with us. And we are trying to build off of that with our current housing survey that's out right now. One key difference that I'll just note is that the regional analysis, because it was started a little more than a year ago, it's using what was then the most current data, which was the ACS one-year data for 2021. We actually have a great opportunity right now. The new ACS 5-year data just came out in early December, so we decided to go ahead and use that data. we had hoped to use the same data set as the regional analysis. However, the 5-year data is a much more robust data set. It's collected over a longer period of time. It includes all localities. It's not, it's a larger sample size, so it's generally considered to be more reliable than the 1-year data. And since it just came out recently, it's also the most current data that we could be using. So, yeah, go ahead.
Counselor Giacomo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is this data being used for trend analysis on this? And if so, obviously our housing market, our housing inventory, everything has gone nuts basically in the last 2 years. So I'm interested to see 5 years ago what the data looked like versus today. That slope's going to look something like this, whereas the 1-year data, even though the 1 year is a year old now, it would be 2 years ago, that's going to look kind of like this. So just curious, for trend analysis, are we still taking into account the 1-year data, or are we using the 5-year kind of in a vacuum?
Well, so we have all of the 1-year data, and we've asked our consultant to compare so that we know if we're going to get like a completely different picture than what the regional analysis is saying. We want to know that and be able to have a really good reason to explain why there's different numbers in the 2 data sets. I think the difference is what you were just explaining, the year that the 2021 1 year is coming from, which I believe they don't even collect data from areas that have less than 65,000 people for that survey. So there's a lot of holes in that data, and we just want to use the best data set available. But I think you're right. You're going to get a different trend when you have a 5-year data set versus a 1-year data set. So we are asking them to look at both.
I'm sorry, can you wait just 1 minute? Mary, were you finished with the presentation here?
Yes, sir.
Can we, I'd just like to let her finish first, and then I'll be open to any questions. Thank you.
So just a quick overview of the schedule. We kicked off this project in late October with a project kickoff meeting, and we've been having every other week, staff has been meeting with Des Moines, our consultants. We've been doing, we've started to do the public engagement, so the consultant has been doing one-on-one stakeholder interviews with different groups in the community. And we just recently launched a survey. It's a housing resilience survey. And so you can get to that from keennh.gov. So I would definitely appreciate all of you filling that out and helping to get that out there. We are also going to be having a workshop in February. So that's on the screen. That's the circle B. So that'll be February 7th, which is a Tuesday at 6 p.m. at Heberden Hall. And that's going to be our one sort of in-person event where people can come out and express concerns. We're going to have a presentation followed by some sort of interactive component. So people will be able to get up and move around and share concerns and learn about what the data is starting to show. And then in March, the consultants will be joining us at the March Joint Planning Board and PLD Committee meeting virtually. To give you a preview of the final report and get your feedback and thoughts on what they've been working on. They'll be coming back in April with a final report before going to City Council with the final report. I think that covers most everything right now. So we're in January, so a lot of the data collection has already been complete. And the consultants will be putting out kind of like a preliminary report at the end of this month. That will not include the projected housing needs yet. It'll just include kind of the snapshot of what our profile is today and what the housing needs are today. And so we'll have sort of a preview of what the final report will look like by the end of this month. I've already mentioned a little bit what we're doing for outreach and engagement. We're doing, I think most of these have already taken place, but we're doing 10 stakeholder interviews. The Housing Resilience Survey was just launched last week, and we're doing that through probably about mid-February. We want to have it run for like a week after the workshop to give people a chance to hear about it and take the survey. It does take about 10 minutes to do. All the responses are anonymous. There's no way for us to know who filled it out. So And the final thing I did want to mention is that because the city got a grant from the Invest NH Housing Opportunity Program Planning and Zoning Grant, we get 3 spots at the UNH Housing Academy, which is it's a mix of in-person and virtual training sessions on messaging and understanding the data behind housing and how to talk about housing. So it's really a training program. It's really geared towards volunteers. So we do have Councilor Omerad is participating on behalf of the city. I believe Chair Russell Slack will be participating, and then we have a staff person who will be attending as well. So I think, and the final deliverables will include both a draft report and a final report. So again, this is really just an overview of the project, so you kind of know what's coming and you're not sort of wondering what this is when when you get coming to your meeting in March. But so yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Councilor Emerald.
Thank you. I noticed you didn't emphasize that much the housing strategy.
Mm-hmm.
You said that we're gonna get mostly what the data is, but isn't it ultimate goal for us to come up with a strategy?
Yes, and I apologize. That is, that's a big part of what the final report will be. There's a lot of data that goes behind it, but at the end, we're getting a report that provides that data, but also a strategy, and that will actually be a list of different actions that we could consider pursuing that will be the most effective way to reach or to fill that housing need that was identified through the data analysis.
Oh, okay. I have a follow-on.
Yep.
Thank you. I've noticed that a free market is putting a lot of people on the street and keeping a lot of people out of housing. So I'm wondering if any of those strategies will involve regulatory solutions or other ways.
Yeah, so I think the strategies, we're really looking at the whole picture here. So certainly some of them could be geared towards regulatory changes or zoning changes, things that we could be doing at the land use level, but it will go beyond that as well. We're expecting that they'll be looking at things like public-private partnerships or even nonprofit public partnerships or developer incentives, home ownership incentives. Even things like investing in infrastructure can help improve housing supply. One component of this study is looking at not just what housing needs to be built, but what housing we need to be protecting that exists today that's vulnerable or at high risk. Because another part of this whole equation is not just what housing is there, but what the quality is of that housing and who would want to live there. So I think we're hoping that we'll get a pretty holistic view of both the situation and different ways that we could try to, or the city could consider trying to fix the problem.
Councilor Giacomo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As part of the surveys they're doing, something that I've noticed a lot, certainly in the last 2 years, has been the rise of short-term rentals, things like that. Houses were bought up here during the rise up to the boom and then converted into Airbnbs. My own old house being one of them, which saddens me greatly. But I'm curious, how does that, if these people generally they do not live locally, so is that being captured in the data? Owners that live out of state but own property up here and are simply renting it out, short-term rentals to make a buck, and it's not actually helping our housing stock, even though it's, technically it's a house that is very livable.
Yes, that's one of the things that we did ask them to look at. And so they're looking at not only owner, so they're looking at a bunch of different characteristics, and one of them is whether a home is owner-occupied or not, but then breaking down the ones that aren't owner-occupied, is it a local landlord or not? And also looking at short-term rentals, Airbnb, I forget the name of the other one, but there's another really popular one out there. Yeah, thank you. And so looking at how many of those units are on the market in Keene and how that may be impacting things. They're also not just looking at Keene, they're also looking at the towns surrounding Keene as well to get a sort of a regional picture of what's going on. So we can also kind of, hopefully we'll be able to compare trends in Keene to the surrounding towns to see if there's anything, if this is part of a larger trend region-wide or, yeah.
Mr. Farrington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hate to sound impatient, but you think the consultant actually is going to come up with like a lot of light bulbs going off just by looking at data in Keene? Or does he already have, you know, a toolkit of strategies that have worked in similar areas? And we could get at those sooner rather than later. I think that would be beneficial. So that's just a comment.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, thank you, Mary. The next item on the agenda is the rural district, and this is a discussion. I'm going to let Jesse Rounds do the presentation for you. Thank you, Jesse.
Good evening, Jesse Rounds, Community Development Director, Madam Chair, members of the Joint Committee. My computer just fell asleep, so I'm going to go off the cuff for a little while as I try to get the password in. But what our staff is really hoping for is feedback from all of you. We last summer brought to you the what we called the 5-to-2 rural district change in the minimum lot size from 5 acres to 2 acres, with the intention of increasing opportunities for development in the rural district. And we had a lot of great discussion. We had a lot of great public comment, both before the Joint Committee, before the planning board listened to another item, but it was related, and then also at the public hearing before the City Council. So we got a lot of great feedback. We have taken that into account and tried to address it through a couple different strategies. But we wanted to come back to you and hear from you and see if you had any concerns that were raised by those public comments or in the time since we brought that forward, had you had any thoughts or ideas. And we also had some alternatives that we wanted to bring up just to see where you wanted us to go as we move forward. So first, I'll just start by saying, do you have any comments, concerns, questions about that? Again, the change from reducing the minimum lot size from 5 acres to 2 acres in the rural district.
Councilor Giacomo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I mean, clearly there was a lot of commentary, a lot of public comment on this, and the one thing that really stuck out for me is the tax impact potential on that. If that parcel now becomes subdividable, that would supposedly will now increase the value of that property, therefore increasing tax rates. That's something that they did nothing wrong. They did nothing, they did not improve the property in any way, did nothing to the property, and the tax rate would just go up because we passed a law that's trying to encourage housing, which we voted on the 5-to-2, this committee, and voted, I think, nearly unanimously when it came through here, and then it failed ultimately in council. But the financial part's something that really stuck out to me is like, that really is hitting people hard if they have an 8-acre lot, a 10-acre lot that can't be put into current use.
Thank you. Yeah, so what if we bring this forward to you, we will actually, we will definitely have, and I have asked him already, to have the assessor come and drill down on that question, what the impact is. Because assessing the way that your assessment is developed is more complex than our office deals with. And you're absolutely right that it is market driven. If there is a development potential there, it can increase the value, but it is based on the value of the properties around it. And so, changes across the market can have a bigger impact possibly than just that zoning district change or the minimum lot size change. So it's more complex, and I don't mean to say that this is not going to have an impact, because it absolutely will. But I would love to have the assessor, Dan Langio, come and really dig into those details for all of you.
Chairman Bosley.
So I would just like to add to that, after the overwhelming public comment, I would have to say that that was probably my number one issue as well. It seems very opposite of what we're trying to accomplish here. And I went and met with Dan, myself, and during the meeting, I asked him what the city's expectation was. Did we think that this would raise taxes when it came back to joint committee to bifurcate? And his answer was simply yes. And so that was not enough for me. So I asked him for a meeting, and we sat down, and very quickly he was able to go through a lot of the ways that their office considers an assessment or value for property. And he did show that some of this ordinance had the potential to decrease value of lots based on the way that properties could be subdivided, and that it was interesting. It's not a simple answer, but I think that he needs to really give us all a very thorough explanation.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions? Did your computer come up yet?
Yes, it did. And I think really what I wanted to dig into that's on my computer just to talk about is really partly the impetus for this change, and then some of the alternatives that we've been looking at, and whether those alternatives would stand on their own or be part of this change. And really, what we're looking at is exactly what Mary's previous presentation was talking about. We have a housing crisis, and this is a possible potential strategy that we can put into play now that can have a positive impact on housing stock in the city. And that's our intention. This is not the solution. This is a solution, a potential way for owners of property in Keene to subdivide their property to develop more housing. And so it's sort of what Mr. Harrington suggested. This is one of our tools that we could implement soon. Although we do want to bring it along with the housing needs analysis. We're not planning on implementing this before we see housing needs analysis data. And we believe that based on the regional study and studies that have been done before this, that this will have a positive impact, but we definitely want to see how the housing needs analysis plays out as we propose these changes. So this is all part of a package, and it's one part of a larger package of changes. And some of the options we've talked about internally with staff is to add to the reduction in minimum lot size changes to the subdivision regulations, not necessarily changing what the subdivision regulations say, but changing how they say it, so that we can encourage the planning board to look at issues of rural character when they're looking at a subdivision. Things like, are there views we want to protect? Are there specific features on a property we want to protect? So as you subdivide, you can look at those. We can also ask the planning board to look at siting for septic systems and those sorts of things that really get at some of these character issues that we want, that I think were reasonably raised by the public over our multiple public hearing opportunities and public comment opportunities. So that's option one, sort of a the minimum lot size change, but with also this added feature of, let's talk more about subdivision regulations. The other option, as when we presented this originally, we said that 58% of the lots in the rural district are currently substandard, meaning they are less than 5 acres, and so technically cannot be developed. And then there are houses that some of these properties have houses on them, and while it is our practice to allow some of those houses to develop, they can add a garage, that sort of thing. If someone came along and knocked down that house to build a larger house, they would actually have to go through a variance in order to develop on that property that already had a house on it. And so what we're trying to get at is an opportunity to develop those substandard parcels. And this change would allow many of those parcels, many of those 58% to become legal conforming lots. One way to get at that alternatively is to rezone, is to draw a line around those, as many of those substandard parcels as we can in some sort of coherent fashion, and come up with a new zoning district that would allow development up to, on parcels up to whatever acreage we wanted to say for that district. The downsides of that are it can take a long time. It's a very slow process, laborious process, and it would be addressing one part of the problem, the existing non-conforming lots. It would not be addressing lots outside of that that might be developed differently. And also, again, it would leave some lots still non-conforming because they just didn't fit in the zoning district. Then I think the last one that we've talked about is actually one it's allowed under the state RSAs. It's called transferable development credits. And the idea here is some parcels in the rural district have development potential, and they could sell that development potential on an open market that the city would not necessarily be involved in. We would set it up, but we wouldn't be involved in it. They could sell that development potential or some other portion of their development right to a different property to increase density or allow, something like that in a different district within the city. This works in some communities, doesn't work in every community. It's complicated. And you have to target it very specifically because you have to get at the issue you're trying to resolve. And so here we're trying to resolve housing shortages. Does the transferable development credit program really address that? Or is it just a way to sort of move development around in the city? And is that a goal that we have? Or do we want to try and spread that development logically around the city? So those are the sort of three things that we've talked about. Don't know if you have any questions about those.
Councilor Giacomo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That last one, what would be the trade-off on that? So you're trading the development potential. Would it be turned into conservation land? Would it be turned into a conservation district, or would it be current use? I mean, what would be the trade-off then?
That's left pretty open in the revised in the RSAs. However, the way I think I've seen it operate in other places is the development potential is removed and replaced by a conservation easement that's held by some third party to maintain the conservation potential on that property or conservation value on that property, and that development right can move somewhere else. And it would not be usually a one-to-one, single-family home right leaves this property, suddenly you can develop 2 houses on this other property. You lose some of that density value as you move the property.
Sure. So what you're saying here then, sorry if I may follow, Madam Chair. So essentially, someone in the rural district would trade 5 acres for a half acre of higher density somewhere, and then that 5 acres, I'm assuming, would be permanent conservation easement. Then that would not be, I know there are some temporary ones out there, but yeah.
Yeah.
So that'd be a permanent conservation if that was, okay.
There are ways to address that. Again, just from experience, there are ways you could say, we're not removing all development potential, we're just minimizing the size of or we're saying, say you have 100 acres, you can have one house lot on that, and the rest of it gets conserved permanently. Those are the sorts of things that we would really have to work out, and that's why it becomes very complex. And I think it works in some places. It's an interesting free market because the city would stay out of the buyer-seller relationship almost completely, just be sort of the marketplace where that happens. So it's an option. But it would be something where we'd really have to figure out what we're trying to conserve and what we're trying to build somewhere else.
Thank you, Gladys Johnson here. I have a question that I've been wondering as we've been listening to all of this and the people who came in to visit. So I don't have this, but if I had a property that I was going to have divided into two, like you're talking about, and they build another house, who owns that house? Me or the new person that's going to live in it? And if the new person that's going to live in it, then wouldn't that new person pay taxes?
Yes, so if you subdivided the property, you could maintain ownership of both parcels, build another house, and rent that property or something like that. And yes, then you would continue to pay taxes. Or you could sell that parcel, build a house, sell it, or sell it vacant, have someone build a house on it, and then they would be the taxpayer on that property.
Thank you
Yep.
for clarifying that.
Councilor Giacomo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, taking up all the
Oh, this
all
is
the
great.
questions tonight.
I really appreciate it.
The other one, it's been a long time since my zoning board days. I'm curious, they said 58% are currently substandard in the rural district. In the zoning, if any variance is required to that property, can a variance be applied to a non-conforming lot then? Or is it, you can apply a variance to that even though it's already non-conforming? So it's
Yes.
developable, you just can't do new building?
Well, I actually, I don't know, John, if you want to address this.
Yeah, so if it's currently a developed, non-conforming lot, we would allow, if there's a single-family home already there and somebody wants to put in an addition, as long as they're meeting the other zoning requirements as far as setbacks and lot coverage and all that, certainly that would be allowed. If it's currently a vacant lot that's non-conforming due to lot size, that would require a variance before the single-family, a building could be built on it, a use could be, attached to that property. But that would be a variance that goes with that property forever. And again, once they built it, if they wanted to put an addition on it, that would be possible as long as they aren't, again, violating another dimensional requirement.
Okay,
for
thanks
that
for the
lot.
clarification. Appreciate that, guys.
Are there any other questions? I mean, are you finished, Jesse, or
I mean,
or do you have?
I'm going to sort of address things as I go, but
Okay.
I really do want to answer any questions you have as I go along, so.
I don't see any questions right now.
Well, I guess, and I do want to respect everyone's time. I want to address some of the specific questions that came up through the public comment. And I think one that was sort of interesting to us is this would be increasing density in a low-density district. And I use that term recognizing there is a low-density district, but this is a district with low-density development. And the genesis of this was really that this district actually had much lower minimum lot sizes throughout its history. It wasn't until the 1970s that the rural district minimum lot size was increased, and that was to address rampant development across the city. And they were worried about the city overwhelming their facilities. And so they increased the lot size to slow development. Now we're in a situation where we're trying to encourage development across the city, and this is an opportunity to return to what the rural district was prior to that change. And so it's an interesting question about character and the history of that character. You know, this character, much of the character in the rural district was developed before the 1970s. So is returning to what it was then going to significantly change it? That's a question I think that would only be answered by time. In terms of environmental impacts, there was a lot of concern that increasing development in the rural district would impact a lot of the things that we hold dear about the rural district, including views, including large undeveloped pieces of land, water, surface waters, steep slopes, those sorts of things. And those are all things that we protect now. As the mayor noted, we have regulations. The state has regulations. The state has regulations about septic systems near waterways, septic systems near other septic systems near wells. So there are a lot of physical limitations on development in the rural district that don't exist in the more densely developed bottom of the bowl here. On the hillsides where the rural district is, there are a lot of physical checks on development. And this change would not affect those physical limitations and our regulatory limitations. Those would remain the same. So I think that's a really important thing. In terms of something we heard regularly that I think the housing needs analysis discussion and the mayor's ad hoc committee on housing stability really pointed out is not true, is there's plenty of housing in Keene. People kept saying that there's plenty of housing. That's is not borne out by the facts at this point. There has been a lot of development in Keene, but those developments fill up. They are fully booked. In terms of vacancy rates, we've heard a variety of different numbers, but the number that we hear most often is that there's a 0.5% vacancy rate in the city. Whether that's rentals and homeowners or owner occupied, I'm not totally confident, but I did some research today, and the general rule of thumb is that vacancy rates for rentals should be about 5%. So if we're at 0.5%, that's a real problem. And for owner-occupied units, it should be about 2%. So again, we are well below that. And that's not something that you can do anything about unless you have more housing to provide for that. And so we're really looking at
Jesse, I have one
Yep.
quick question. So I'm just going to go back 2 years. How much development has there been? Do we know that?
I don't know if I can have a number for you. I don't know.
In housing and/or apartments?
We can get that number.
Madam Chair, our consultants asked us to provide a list of developments that have occurred in the last 3 years that had 10 or more units, and there were 0. However, we recently had some that were recently approved, or at least conditionally approved. So I think we're seeing that trend shift a little bit. But I think we had a little bit of a lull after the Washington Apartments project was approved and the Colony Mill, which were some of the larger developments that happened maybe more like 5 years ago now. Since then, there's been a little bit of a lull, and hopefully we're seeing that turn around a little bit now.
Do we know, I'll get to you in one moment, Mayor Hansel, thank you. Do we know how many housing units we need around?
We will know in April.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're close, but no cigar. Mayor Hansel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to answer your question, I mean, we need this, I was involved in the statewide Housing Stability Council, which is where that sort of kicked off all of this localization of the housing discussion. And it was, at the time, it was 15 to 20,000 units we were short in the whole state. And that was like before COVID. So you spread that around the state, it's absurd. I mean, we are so behind. I don't even see how we can dig ourselves out. It's really like trying to dig a hole with a spoon, you know? But I feel kind of badly because I feel like the staff right now is trying to defend the decision to bring some of this stuff up, which is controversial, and I get that. But this was asked for by the city council. This was asked for by me. This has been asked for by lots of people in the community who have been struggling to find an adequate place to live. And that's where this is coming from. And yes, some of it can be controversial, but ultimately, if you want my feedback, we did some political maneuvering to separate this 5-2 question out, but we need to bring this before the city council and have them look at it and vote it up or down. That's what I think should happen. I've heard strong arguments on both sides of being in favor or against that, but I think that's what we owe the community. So I hope that the staff will continue on and do that for us and give our community a chance to really decide if it wants to start tackling the housing crisis or if we are satisfied with the way things are now.
I totally agree. Does anyone else have any other questions, comments?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Gladys Johnson.
Thank you, Councilor Johnson.
What keeps going through my mind is, and it's pretty complex, but how do we include the surrounding areas like the little towns? There's plenty of small towns that might have what we want or what we need. Is there a way of working together? Or would they have to take care of their own process and then we have to take care of our own process?
It's a great question. We do participate in the regional planning commission, and that allows us to have lots of conversations with our neighbors. But in terms of regulatory sharing, there isn't really a mechanism for that, as far as I understand it. I'm new to New Hampshire, but it would be difficult to do, and it also it's an interesting question with respect to tax base as well as impact to roads and business development. It's we're going to need the whole region to increase housing because as the mayor pointed out, we're way behind. So everybody has to build housing, and everybody has to do it in a way they're comfortable with. Our more rural neighbors are going to have that opportunity to develop on those large lots. Some of our communities like Swansea might have the ability to do more dense development, and we have a lot of we have the entire mix, and that's how we I think we have that huge benefit is that we can develop every type of housing option out there. So that's, yeah.
I just have a question, Jesse, and I'm not sure you can answer this, but when the city of Keene is doing the housing needs analysis, I might be thinking about the wrong committee, but aren't they going to reach out to some of the towns? I'm sorry, Jesse.
No, that's okay.
So, Madam Chair, this is Mary Brenner, Senior Planner. They're looking at data, like market data and housing data for the surrounding towns. Southwest Region Planning Commission is doing a regional housing assessment, and I believe part of the regional housing needs assessment, one of the items that they're working on is something called a fair share analysis, which I believe they've hired a statewide consultant to work on that. Those results are pending. I haven't seen any data from that yet, but I think what they're trying to do with the fair share analysis is take that number that the mayor mentioned and try to figure out what's the fair share that each community should be striving for. And so they are trying to actually look at the town level, okay, how much housing should this town be providing based on their population and what they already provide. And I don't really have any details on that, but I know that that's part of the regional analysis. So we should have something on that within the next couple months, I believe. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought there was something like that included in the analysis, so I think it would be helpful for our community to know that. Councilor Giacomo.
Thought I was done. Thank you, Madam Chair. I get another question regarding the housing needs analysis. How granular does the data get when we get into, for instance, house size and things like that? Because the reason I'll extrapolate on why I'm asking this question is that having lived in the North Central neighborhood in Keene for quite a while, there are a lot of quite large houses there that are owner-occupied, and owners are potentially aging, or they bought the house in the 1950s, 60s, something like that, and are still living there, but in the near future, potentially they're limited mobility or looking to downsize, things like that could dramatically impact our housing market in a hurry. In the course of 5-10 years, we could see a lot of vacant, very large houses open up. And I know we've already, through what we've done here, through what we've done with City Council, we've kind of poked at the high density, medium density. But a lot of that housing stock is, I don't know how you analyze it properly to be able to look at potential to fit the needs of the people that, like the hospital can't find any housing for the new people coming in. The employers around here can't hire people because they don't have anywhere to live. I don't know about suitability, but I guess the first thing I'd look at is, does it ask about square footage? Does the suitability for being multi-unit?
So I'll try to answer, and then Mary will correct me in every way that I'm wrong. So thank you, Mary, in advance. So first, the survey does ask those questions. It asks about house size. It asks about household size. It asks, and so we can get at it that way. There's also, Mary mentioned the ACS, the American Community Survey, that gets at some of those age versus house size questions. So we can get that data. That data will be used as part of the housing needs analysis and so we will get that and can use that. Mary, I don't know if there's.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the Camoin scope of work right now, like a more detailed scope of work. And part of their housing needs analysis, they're going to be looking at different market segments. And I'm just going to read them off to you, so maybe that will kind of help answer your question. But they're looking at, so everything from under-housed individuals, so that includes people that are living with parents or family members or other roommates because they cannot find suitable housing to meet their needs. They're also going to be looking at population growth, so new households through either household formation or in-migration, including from attracting remote workers as a potential driver for housing demand. They're also looking at economic job growth, so new jobs in and around the city that would attract new workers in need of housing. They're looking at cost-burdened households, which is households that are currently spending more than 30% of their income on housing expenses. Displaced commuters, these are workers that have jobs in the city but are commuting from further away than they would prefer because they cannot find housing, suitable housing to meet their needs closer. Mismatched households, so these are households that may have housing they can afford and in the location they prefer, but it doesn't align with their needs for other reasons, such as the type of housing. So for example, if somebody's renting when they would prefer to own, I'm getting there, don't worry. Households living in substandard housing, these households live in units that may be lacking full kitchen facilities, plumbing, et cetera, or otherwise substandard or obsolete. And the last category is the empty nester and senior households, often a source of housing demand for downsized units and housing offering care and services. And so those are the market segments that they're going to be looking at. If you thought, or if you can think of something that's missing from that list, certainly let us know. But it says, I think really this is what they do. This is their expertise, their area of expertise. They look at markets, they analyze them, and they look at economic development specifically through the lens of housing. And so I'm pretty confident that they're going to have a good analysis for us. But that, I think what you brought up is a really great point. Another piece that we'll probably be looking at as the city is for those large houses that are currently single family or maybe two family and they want to convert and add in units to that large house, there are currently a lot of barriers. Some of them are regulatory or local zoning. Some of them are, building code or fire code issues that are difficult to address. So those are things that you're probably going to hear us talking about into the future.
Well, thank you. Look forward to the report.
Karen Bosley.
So I think listening to Councillor Giacomo's comments just made me realize that I have a mother-in-law who lives in town, and she's in her 70s, and she lives in a single-family home that she raised my husband in. She would love to move to a one-story, near the rail trail, her lawn was taken care of situation, but they don't exist here. So you do have people aging in these big houses. There's nowhere for them to move to that's still in town. I manage an in-home care agency, and what I would tell you is if you're aging, don't leave town, because it's hard enough for us to find staff that will support individuals in their homes here in the city. But once you've moved to Sullivan or Westmoreland or some of the outlying towns, your potential for receiving care into your elder years is going to diminish significantly. So we need to be able to look at, through the analysis and through our code writing, how we can create opportunities for some of these developments or different styles of developments to happen here in the community that don't just support, wealthy people from Connecticut who want to work from home, but who support people who live here already. And how can we maintain the people that are here in a way that they can age gracefully and in place? And how do our kids afford to live here? I bought my house about 8 years ago, and I couldn't afford to buy it now. What has happened in the last 2 or 3 years is frankly obnoxious. And one of the things that I asked for when I heard about this housing analysis is, can we get some data on COVID migration? How many people got offered work from home jobs and packed up from wherever they were from and looked at Keene and thought it was the most beautiful place on earth and snapped up these super cheap, great houses? And how many families of people who've lived here forever, who now can't rent or were asked to leave their apartment for whatever reason so that somebody could, a new owner-occupied situation could happen, how many of those people have left and moved to the bedroom communities, have left and gone to Swansea, have gone to Troy? So when my kids are grown and they come back from college, are they going to be able to stay here? Or am I going to have to move into the garage apartment so that they can have a place to live? Those are the things that I am concerned about. And we talked about it a lot over this process. I think that we are looking at each individual zone. The 5 to 2 acres needed to stand on its own. It needs to have its own, time in the sunshine to see if it's what we all decide is the right thing for the community. But I absolutely think each one of these zones needs to have some massaging so that we can figure out what we can do, because it's not a good situation.
Yeah. I really appreciate that comment. Again, this is one part of a package that we're hoping to look at zoning districts across the city to try and address this. And like you said, this is one part of that. That's all I've got. Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse and Mary and John, for all your comments and all your work on this. This is a really, really big project, and I can't wait to continue the discussion. Does anyone else have any other comments? Okay, so, I'm sorry, Councilor Johnson.
Yes, it's just kind of a philosophical thinking, but this isn't just us. This is our area, it's our city, it's our country, it's our other countries. I mean, this is people, there are many people. And so part of me thinks, this is not my style, but part of me thinks, this is what we have, this is what we're going to keep, and the rest of them go figure it out. But that's obviously not sensible. But I think we have to keep that in mind as we're trying to make these big decisions. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other comments? Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, John. Our next meeting for the PB, Planning Board and Planning Licenses and Development Committee, is February 13th, to be confirmed. And so right now, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. It is 8:10 p.m. Thank you.